Please be seated. Rabbi Rosen, Rabbi Garber, Cantor Ness, friends, and most importantly, survivors and their families. My name is Stu Abrams, and I'm humbled to have the honor of welcoming all of you to the 2019 Yom HaShoah commemoration. I want to thank all of the members of the Yom HaShoah committee for their passionate efforts in making tonight's reflection so meaningful and consequential. It has been an enormous privilege for me to have served as your co-chair for the past 2 years. Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day which is a signal call to a renewed importance of reflection and contemplation, is commemorated each year as a day when the world pauses to remember the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and to recall the Holocaust. Remembering the millions who died and those who lived on, many to tell their stories to a generation born more than half a century later. To the younger among us, the Holocaust can feel like ancient history. Why is it important that we remember? And why do we continue to utter the mandate of never again when the reality is that genocide occurred again in Cambodia and Rwanda and continues to occur again and again in parts of the world even today? It is often said that our youngest generation will be the last to meet and hear survivors tell their own stories, and those young minds that have this privilege are unlikely to ever forget it. There are important lessons to be learned from survivors' words and experiences, lessons that continue to have relevance for students' lives today in the 21st century. One important lesson is about the tendency of hate to escalate when it is unchecked. When we witness everyday acts of insensitivity, bias, or intolerance, it's easy to turn our backs and walk away, to avoid getting involved. Many did just that in Europe almost 80 years ago, and that subtle bias was able to grow, fester, and metastasize. We have often been reminded that the Holocaust did not begin at the gates of the concentration camps. It began with the rhetoric of hate, words that grew into prejudice and then into acts of discrimination and bias, which motivated violence and finally genocide, which ultimately led to the unconscionable belief that the killing of another human being is nothing extraordinary. We are required to remember the Holocaust because of our hope that the world will never again go through darkness as deep as that, but also because we know that the millions who did not survive to tell their stories took with them a world of lost possibilities. They would want to know that they were not, nor will they ever be, forgotten. And because today's youth will be the last to hear survivors speak in person, there is a renewed importance, obligation, and urgency to find new ways to keep their stories alive. But how do we do that? And how do we inspire in one another the motivation to make never again the reality the world so longs for? We can begin by taking a moment wherever we are to remember those who died. We can be witnesses who carry on the stories we have heard and share with others. We can ensure that students today have opportunities to reflect on the lessons of the Holocaust and to hear the stories of survivors, resistors, and rescuers. And we can take the time to stop and take a stand against the insensitive, biased, and intolerant words and acts that happen around us. Working together, we may even turn the hope of never again into a global reality. In closing, as we continue in our lives to labor for justice and look forward to a future with hope, I'd like to share 2 brief quotes from Anne Frank, one of the most discussed and arguably the most famous victim of the Holocaust. I pray that these words of this Jewish teenager will bring light into our darkest moments. She said, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." And then she said, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." My interpretation of her beautiful words is we are all heroes in waiting, just waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate our courage and our heroism and bring Anne's dreams to reality. As this most recent tragedy illustrates, anti-Semitism continues to be a growing and deadly menace in the United States and worldwide. The Holocaust remains as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked anti-Semitism and the way the rhetoric of hate can infect a society. As Americans and as human beings, we must unequivocally condemn anti-Semitism and confront it with courage and bravery, wherever it might appear. Again, thank you so much for attending tonight's commemoration.
In honor of the 6 million, we'll have 6 candles lit in their memory. When I call your name, please come and light a candle. Bella Becker, Polish ghetto of Lankut and later Siberia. Irving Becker, Ukrainian ghetto in Sarny and hidden in the forest. Martin Schultz, displaced child in Ansbach, Germany. Sylvia Brill, the death trap of Transnistria. Nili Doron, Chernovitz Ghetto. Ernest, Bumi, Gelb, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dora, Ehrlich, Oranienburg.
Began Eden צרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו כשלום על משכבותיהם. ונאמר אמן.
Good evening, survivors, rabbis, and distinguished guests. According to the Conference on Jewish Materials Claims Against Germany, a survivor is a Jew who was in the camps, ghettos, or in hiding under Nazi occupation. It is you, the survivors, who we honor here today. It is you who we look to hear stories of life before the war and what your experiences were during the war. So we can document it, so we can learn from it, so we can remember it. And so we can ensure that this dark moment in Jewish history lives on in the public consciousness, reminding us of the depths to which society is capable of sinking. The responsibility to speak up and to keep the memory and lessons of the Holocaust alive falls on each and every one of us and is more important than ever before. The horrific events of yesterday in San Diego and 6 months ago in Pittsburgh are just two more warning signs that the tide of anti-Semitism in this country and around the world is rapidly rising. We need to stand as one. We need to speak with one voice to make sure everyone's voice is heard. The world needs to hear the voice of the survivors and the voice of those that did not survive. They need to know never again.
Hi, my name is Tehila Edelman. I am the great-granddaughter of Bumi Gelb, a Holocaust survivor, a dear man I call my Saba. I'm here today representing all of his great-grandchildren. My Saba is my role model because after all the unimaginable pain, hardships, and trauma he has been through, he still continued to have a positive outlook on life and a close relationship with God. When my Saba came to America to rebuild his family, he taught his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren the importance of Jewish values. I am who I am today because of my Saba. One important lesson I learned from my Saba is that as long as you remain focused, stay positive, and know that God is with you, wherever you go and whatever you do, you can achieve anything in life. It's important that we're all here today to hear my Saba's story and to never forget what the Jewish people have been through, because by knowing our past, we can move forward as a stronger people. Now, introducing my role model, the patriarch in our family, a God-fearing man, my dear Saba, Bumi Gelb. Please come up.
Thank you. My story is simply about one person who survived the atrocities of the Holocaust. Let us remember and hold in our hearts the 6 million plus who did not. It was just this time of the year, Pesach, 1944. I was seated at a table. I was not quite 17, with my dear mother, Miriam Gelb, my 3 precious sisters, Libu, 14, Zlata, 12, Blima, 10, and my aunt Mali. My father, Emil Gelb, Menachem Mendel, had been taken to the Hungarian slave labor camps 3 years before, along with about 30 other men from our small village, Sils, in Subcarpathia, which used to be Czechoslovakia, now is Hungary. About 60 families, Jewish families, lived in our village, amongst 2,000 families who were Greek Orthodox. On this sacred evening, Pesach, the Jewish homes were eerily without fathers at the head of the table. My mother asked me to conduct the Seder. Slowly, I start. We all break out crying. We missed our father terribly. By that time, we knew our situation was very, very bad because we saw SS troopers visibly everywhere. There was a knock at the door. Hungarian border guards, the most vicious and feared, fully allied with the Nazis. They were now appearing at each Jewish household at the time of the Seder. They shouted at us, "Pack up, you have 7 days. Take as many belongings as you want. You're being relocated." They said it was because of the Russian onslaught which is about to happen. We knew it was a lie because only Jewish homes were visited. Our Jewish men men were already in the horrible slave labor camps. Looking back, I realized that only about 5 or 6 from our village out of the 30 survived and returned after the war. So we packed food, bedding, anything that could be loaded in the wagon they provided. Pain, fear gripped us. My mother, very devout, loved and respected by so many. My mother, around the age of 35, had previously gathered the local Jewish mothers together in our home. A 3-room house built and lived by the Gelbs since the early 1700s. Our home, no electricity, no running water, but there was love and hospitality and deep, warm spirituality. My mother offered the women guidance on how to best manage their homes and families during the absence of their husbands. The fear was palpable. No hope in sight. We were taken for a short while to HaShoah and then to Munkach Ghetto, which is a huge brick factory. We came together with much of the Subcarpathian Jewry, at least 10 or more villages in that camp. Life in the ghetto was insufferable. No privacy, constant fear of beating from the Hungarian troops and from the German SS who controlled us. Crying everywhere, cruelty everywhere. In May 1944, the train with cattle cars started entering the ghetto. We were shoved into them, families still together, but not knowing where we are going or where we are going to be taken. Physical condition deplorable. We arrived at Auschwitz 3 days later at about HaShoah's time. Auschwitz, the separation began. Very quick, crying, screaming. Smokestacks in the background. One moment, the family together. A moment later, separation was final. We found out the next day that children who were not of working age and older people were gassed and burned in crematorium. My dear little sisters, Zlatko and Blincho, so many others. Hearing this, I decided I needed to volunteer to anywhere out of Auschwitz. For me, it was the beginning of 4 more nightmarish, horrific concentration camps. Next, Buchenwald, where I was processed and given the number 55562. No more name, now simpler number. Following a short stay, I was sent to Dora, a satellite of Bochum. We performed back-breaking labor building brick walls and the newly completed tunnels where V2 rockets were manufactured and rained upon England. We heard about 30,000 people died the year before building these tunnels. I remember how some mornings on our march to work, which is about 20 minutes from our barracks, one would start davening and we all followed quietly. It was forbidden. Communication among the prisoners was completely forbidden. But just the same, we took a chance. And it was in Dora that many prisoners, many of us, chose to fast for Yom Kippur. After about 4 months, at the end of November '44, truckloads of us were transferred to Elrich, also a satellite of Bochum, an horrific place. Prisoners constantly dying of starvation. Between 4 and 5 o'clock every morning, very scantily dressed for the bitter freezing cold weather, we were forced to stand for a repetitive, brutal counting. Always visible were stacks of bodies 40 to 50 feet tall. It was winter. And surely visible to the people around the camp. They would eventually be removed and shipped to crematorium Bochum, over and over. About 3 months after we arrived in Elrich, extremely malnourished, I developed a severely gangrenous left foot. I put on a rag on it, which stuck to it, it couldn't be removed, and I could no longer work. So, my throat tight, my heart beating wildly, frozen to the marrow, I decided to take a chance and to go to the infirmary, knowing fully well there would be no return. No one ever returned without the infirmary. Following the subsequent transfer to the dreaded typhus ward. The Nazis at that time started to evacuate because the Allies closed in. So we prisoners from the typhus ward were put in open train cars, perhaps 80 in a car, with food for 5 days, and the next 4 days there was no food at all. Many people died. Every stop, the dead were taken out. After 9 days, the train arrived at Oranienburg, which was where, when we arrived, only 8 of us were literally carried out, which, thinking back, totally miraculous. Why would anybody want to carry us out? And placed in near barracks. The camp Oranienburg was very close to Berlin, and the siege by the Russian army was fully on. There was constant bombardment, artillery, and bullets were flying left and right, and I couldn't move. Right? Left and right of me. Friends helped me with basic needs. Around April 16, 45, the Germans left, and the Russians came in, and we were declared free. I was taken to the local military hospital. The Russian doctors performed surgery on my leg. I went into a coma for 2 months. When I woke up, I made my way back to my village, Sils, Subcarpathia. Fortunately, as bad as it was, I found my father, and my sister, and my aunt, my dear mother, and 2 younger sisters, and more than 100 relatives perished. April 1948. My father, sister, my Aunt Molly, and I arrived in New York to be welcomed by relatives with whom we celebrated Pesach that evening. I got a job, went to high school, some college, served in the military in the Korean War, married my wife Sally, my dear Sally, who chose with all her heart to bring into our home the continuity of my warm religious home and its richly spiritual previous generation. Thank you, Sally. Thank God, our dear children, Ellie, Miriam, Ezra, precious grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Our little jewelry store, which was closed on Shabbos, helped sustain us financially. We have enjoyed an open home. We're deeply connected to our little young Israel of Hartford for more than 40 years, to Chabad, now Young Israel West Hartford, to the Hebrew Academy, the Mikveh, our beloved Israel. April, tonight, 28, 2019. I would like to thank you, dear Ezra, Miriam, Tehillah, for being here together with us, with me, this evening, and representing our family. My dear Sally and I have indeed been blessed to see generations deeply connected to Hashem, our Torah, our people, Israel, and praying for the good of all peoples coming together in peace.
Thank you, Bumi. What a privilege and an honor. Thank you for sharing your testimony with us this evening. It is now my honor to welcome Bumi's son, Ezra Gelb, granddaughter, Miriam Edelman, great-granddaughter, Tehillah Edelman, with me on the bima for a conversation between generations. So I am struck that we gather here on the day after Pesach, and we think that when we commemorate Pesach and we remember the Exodus from Egypt and we think about the festival of liberation, we also tell the story. As it says in the Torah, "V'higadet levincha," you should tell your children. So I want to ask each of you, when you hear your father, Ezra, grandfather, Miriam, great-grandfather, Tehillah, share his experiences, what do each of you see as the obligation of memory that is passed on to you? Ezra, you can start.
So our parents brought us up in a very loving environment, religiously, respectfully, to love and honor others. And that message continues, and we try to treat people with kindness, with love, with respect. And my father was asked, taunted, when you were 11 years old, what kind of a Jew are you? Are you a Ukrainian Jew, a German Jew? What kind of a Jew are you? And my father said, I'm a Jewish Jew. And that's what we try to aspire to be. We try to be unified, we try to be together, and as my father said, we want peace for everyone.
What do you see as the obligation of memory that is passed on to you by your grandfather? Why is it so important to remember?
Well, first of all, it's extremely important to remember because any younger generation, first of all, I have to start with the younger generations. It's a huge opportunity to have a survivor here. And I'm sorry, I'm not a big speaker and I'm a little nervous. The reason it's so important is because we don't want history to repeat itself. We have we have a few survivors left, and we need to reach out and hear their story. And our children have to hear the story so they can pass it to their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And because when we hear the story from our survivors, it enables us to hear our past, where we've been, and God willing, it will strengthen us and unify us as a nation going forward. So this is all important. All children who haven't met a survivor and people who haven't, even adults who haven't met, it's important that we meet and we hear their story and make it part of us and part of our lives.
So it's important to remember because we become stronger from learning about our past.
Thank you. So as you hear Bumi share his experiences, I wonder which parts of his story, when you hear them, resonate the most with you, and when you tell others about what he went through, which part of his experiences do you most want people to know and to learn from? And Tehillah, I'll start with you.
The story that resonates most with me is the dedication of my great-grandfather to be reunited with his father and sister and to rebuild his family. And the parts that I want people to know his experiences, to learn from, is how my Saba never gave up even in the darkest times when it was really hard for him.
I actually have a few things. So before the war, it's so important to me, was the way my grandfather was raised in a home of love and Torah observance, and the way my grandmother raised my grandfather was very special thing to me, being I'm named after his mother, Miriam. And when she was about, I think she was about 37, was around my age, her husband was sent to the labor camps. And she had to watch her children by herself. She had to keep the family businesses going by herself. And she could have, her son was away, my grandfather was away at the time. He was learning in yeshiva, and it would have been an amazing opportunity for him to come back to help. But my grandmother was so dedicated to Torah and wanted my grandfather to stay and continue doing his learning, even though it would have made it harder for her. She wanted him to stay there. And the way that she raised, and my great-grandparents raised my grandfather, is the way that my grandmother and my grandfather raised their children, and they've raised their grandchildren and grandchildren with an open home and Torah and mitzvos and dedication and working hard. I have another story. Can I say something else? Another idea also was when my grandfather was close to liberation. So the Russians were liberating them, and my grandfather was a mere 70 pounds, and he was starving, and we can't imagine the pain and the hunger that was going on. And he remembered a Gemara that he learned when he was a couple years earlier, when he was about 15, that when a person is starving and they're fasting for so long, and they jump into eating a large abundance of food, their stomach can expand and they can actually die instantaneously. So my grandfather remembered that, and at that time of such hunger, he was able to bring his Torah knowledge forefront and not only save himself, but he was telling others and helping others and letting them know that, and he saved other people's lives because of that. At such a hard time, he had the mindset to help others, and that's my grandfather. And I have one more thing. Today, recently, my son became bar mitzvahed, and it was obviously a very holy time. And my grandfather called me up saying that he had a set of tefillin for my son, but it wasn't just his tefillin, it was his father's tefillin that he had. And my son happens to be, he was named after him, and it was a beautiful thing to be able to pass down the tefillin from his father to my son, and to continue and showing the continuity and the mitzvah continuing from, even though there was the Holocaust in the middle, that the mitzvah continued being passed down from my great-grandfather down to my son, and continuing to put on the tefillin every day. So I just wanted to share that.
Sure, I'll repeat it. So the question for you, Ezra, is when you hear your father share his testimony, his experiences, what part stands out most for you, and what do you want others, when you retell his story, others to learn from the most from what he went through?
So my father, thank God, is a survivor, but just because the Holocaust was over doesn't mean everything's fixed. And when my dad met my mom and they started talking, my mom could tell my dad wasn't 100%. So my mother said to my father, "Do you want the Germans to finish what they started?" That brought my father clarity. That set my father and my mother on the path to healing, to discovery, to realizing there is something to hope for, there is something in the future, and we're going to make a family, and we're going to make a life, and thank goodness you did.
So I have one more question for all of you, and I want to end with Bumi. We'll give Bumi a chance to answer this question as well. So we sit here tonight united as a community. We're here in Bethel. And as Rabbi Rosa noted, we're gathered here together as a community, and we note the terrible events that happened yesterday in San Diego. And at the same time, we are united by our strength together. And in fact, last month when I met with Bumi, he cited for me this verse from Shmuel, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, the eternal strength of Israel shall not be belied. And so my last question for each of you is, when we remember the horrible events of the Holocaust and we think about traumatic experiences that Jews have gone through without history, what do you see as sort of the way in which Jews respond? What is the Jewish response to these types of horrible events? And we'll pass it down the line and let Bumi answer last.
So, in our time, we have Israel. We have a Jewish nation. My father and mother always told us how lucky we are, how privileged we are to be able to worship as Jewish people in the United States. It's not a given. This freedom is not a given. So we move forward with hope and commitment. We do kindness. We do good. And that's how we honor our past, and that's how we forge ahead to our future.
A couple of years ago, the way I can relate to this is, a couple of years ago I was going through something traumatic, and I needed to turn to somebody who went through more than I could imagine anyone. And I turned to my Saba, who went through more trauma, more pain than anyone could imagine. And I said, I need to make a decision in life. I need your guidance. What helped you make the decision that you made to stand strong and not to give up and to go forward and want to rebuild? What advice would you give to somebody like me who's going through a lot? My grandfather said, and this is what he told me. One, he said, I needed to be completely honest with myself when making the decision. Two, I needed to 1 minute, needed to be completely honest with myself. The second thing was I needed to know what I wanted out of life itself and what I wanted out of life. And three was I knew whatever decision I was going to make would affect my children, my grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And with that, I was able to make my decision. And with that, we're surrounded here because of you and because of your decisions you've made. You're surrounded with your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and you've taught us unbelievable values that we can attain anything in life if we stay focused, if we stay close to God, and we do the will of God in Torah, mitzvahs, and Ma'asim Tovim. We can attain anything.
The response I see to Jewish trauma is, through the ages, the Jewish people have united and turned to God.
We are grappling with unprecedented losses. We have been grappling with unprecedented losses. And the important decision that people made, Jewish people, is turn back to Torah, because that connects us as not only as a people, it connects us to God, and it unites us. And everybody does what they can, as much as they can, or as little as they can. But the main thing is, we are not Jews because of suffering. We have positive things to look forward to build. We need to build generations, knowledgeable generations, who are able to withstand the verbal onslaughts, especially in the colleges today. Unfortunately, many very bright students, Jewish are completely undereducated Jewishly, and therefore, unfortunately, many of them join organizations which are anti-Jewish. And that is something that we still have to work on to make us proud Jews. And it comes from the family, it comes from the rabbis who give drushes and shuls, it comes from education, and that is the most important, in my opinion, in order to go forward and to keep building.
Thank you, Bumi, Ezra, Miriam, and Tehillah.
So much, and we invite everyone to remain standing at this time for the Mourners Kaddish. If you would like to follow, please look at the read the smaller books.
Page 58. Page 58 for Kaddish on behalf of all of those who have perished. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemer rabah b'alma divra kirutei b'yalich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'yibru amei yehi shemer rabah mevarach le'alam u'lamei amayam yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitala shemei d'kudsha b'richu le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen oseh shalom imramav hu ya'aseh shalom Aleinu v'yal Yisrael v'imru. Amen. And please remain standing for the partisan song and Hatikva.
Sorg niet kemel als du gehst den letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleiene verstellen Leute. Kommen wird noch unser ausgewählte Show. So wird verbeugt und unser Trott wird zählen do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgewählte Show. So wird verbeugt und unser Trott unter seine Do. Von grünem Palmenland bis weiten Land von Schnee. Wir kommen und mit unser Bein, mit unser Weh. Und wo gefallen ist, spritzt und unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gewirr, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen ist, spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gewürre, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgen zum Partilen uns dem Heid. Unser Nächten wird verschwinden mit den Feld. Nur versammeln wird die Zund und Geor. Wie a Parol so geht das Lied von uns zu Dor. Nur versammeln wird die Zund und der Geor. Wie a Parol so geht das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Das Lied der Streben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Weh. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von a Vogel läuft er frei. Das hat der Volk der Fischen fand und liegt gewählt. das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in der Hand. Das hat der Volk zwischen Fallen dicke Wehen, das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg, Gott Himmel bleiene verstellen Leute, kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show, so wird der Point und unser Trott wir zählen do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show, so wird der Point und unser Trott wir zählen do.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Next year, when we gather, may we find a world that is filled with shalom, tzedek, umishpat, a world of peace, of goodness, and justice, and tikkun. Laila tov.